Of all the first followers of Jesus, there is one guy we hear about the most, and when it came to his teacher's cause, he went all in. Peter, a fisherman with an act first, think about it later attitude. It's easy to see why he was 110% on board. He was there for all of the big miracles and events of Christ's mission. He saw him walk on water, got to join in. He saw 5,000 people get fed, and to top it all off, he was the first person to see Jesus after his resurrection. Peter was named by Christ as the rock on which his church would be built, a play on words, as Peter, in ancient Greek, translates to rock or stone. And this fisherman, who was sometimes referred to as Simon or Simon Peter, would go on to help build the foundations of the early church, which we can see in his appearances in the Gospels and Acts. He's even got 2 letters in the New Testament attributed to him. But what happened next to Peter? And what's all this Pope business about? Well, to answer this question, we have to go right back to the church at Pentecost. Who stood up and gave a grand speech to those wondering what was going on? Who was getting right on with preaching the gospel? That's right, it was Peter. From the get-go, his attitude made him pretty much the de facto leader of the apostles and therefore the church. His first sighting of Christ and Jesus' rock comments gave him that bit of legitimacy amongst the believers. It was Peter who decided that they needed to replace Judas Iscariot, and it's often him who got dragged off to the Sanhedrin to explain what all this Jesus business was all about. But that said, there was no structure to the church at this point, and he led the believers alongside the apostles James and John. The church began to grow thanks to the many missions going on across Israel and beyond, and soon it was prudent to create leadership positions to ensure that churches that were miles apart would be on the same page. Now, while you would think that Peter should have been an absolute shoo-in for the role of Bishop of Jerusalem, the title instead went to James. Now, this does not mean that Peter stopped being a prominent leader in the church. In fact, it could be said that this freedom to keep doing his own little thing enriched it. After all, he was out and about, on mission when he got his vision of a sheep and converted Cornelius. And this helped make him, as well as Paul, a strong voice against Christianity just being a Jewish thing. Paul, in fact, later rebuked Peter for going along with some of the more traditional Jewish Christians. On to the Pope thing then. Well, the Pope is also known as the Bishop of Rome, and according to church tradition, the guy who started up the church in Rome was Peter, even though it's never mentioned in the Bible. However, the church fathers in the following centuries documented Peter's presence in their writing. So, from what we can gather from these chaps, at some point the Roman church was founded by Peter and possibly Paul, with Peter staying behind to look after things while Paul carried on doing his thing. Peter still preached and looked after his flock, and it's mentioned that he and Paul even nominated a successor at some point. According to church tradition, which was later backed up by the writings of church historians Origen and Tertullius years later, Peter sadly lost his life to persecution, round about the year 64 CE. This, of course, was the year of the Great Fire of Rome. Nero sentenced Peter to death by crucifixion, but Peter requested that he was to be crucified upside down as he felt he was not worthy to share the same fate as his master. His request was granted and his sentence carried out, and the upside down cross became the symbol of Peter and his martyrdom. From here, we now have to skip forward quite a few centuries, and we've got the event that shaped the global church as we see it now, the Great East-West Schism of 1054. Now, this event is very, very complicated, so I won't go into any major detail right now, but the gist is this. The church was up until this point a single entity, and there was a lot of disagreement going on. One of the big ones was whether the church should be led by one supreme bishop, or pope. The disagreements continued to escalate and became such that they reached a tipping point, and the church was then split in two. One side became what we know as the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the other, the Catholic Church. As we all know, the Catholics are run by a head honcho from his seat in the Vatican, situated in Rome. This then is the Peter connection. He was the founder of this ancient branch of the church and was its leader, its bishop, so all of the popes are regarded as having the same baton passed down to them from one of the original leaders of the church. And this is kind of where the Peter story ends. It's not as dramatic or action-packed as the adventures of, say, Paul or Thomas, but in light of this, it has to be said that you can't underestimate the impact that Peter had on the church. He helped to expand its horizons, not only in terms of geography, but who got to be in the club in the first place, with his trip to see Cornelius. all of his missteps in Scripture have been a great source of comfort to many believers over the centuries, because after even some total blunders, Jesus still wanted him on the team. I'll certainly raise a glass to that. This was a part of a series of what happened to the apostles. Now, if you want to see what happened to Paul or Thomas, as I mentioned, then you might not click the playlist in the top card. And if you want to learn about James, then click on the card on the bottom. And if it's not there yet, well, the best way to find out when that video drops is to subscribe and hit the little bell thing so you get told when it arrives. But until next time, go grab yourself a drink and keep asking questions.